evening and welcome to our special coverage of the war in Ukraine. I'm Amarachi Ubani.
And I'm Millicent Walker. First, the headlines. Smoke billowing and explosions from what Ukrainian Ministry of Defense says is a Russian ship at Berdyansk port as fighting marks a month since invasion began.
The NATO leaders meet in Brussels approved major increases in the alliance's forces in Eastern Europe during an emergency summit in Brussels.
And Zelensky says Ukraine deserves to be a full member of EU as he addresses NATO. Also asks people everywhere to take to the streets in show of support for Ukraine.
Well, welcome again. A Russian landing ship has been destroyed. 2 other vessels damaged in the occupied Ukrainian port city of Berdyansk. Details of what caused the explosion and the fire on board the ship are still unclear.
Berdyansk, which is west of the besieged port of Mariupol, was seized 4 days after Russia invaded Ukraine. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization is striving to provide healthcare support to Ukrainians under challenging circumstances as more refugees flee the war there. Here's a brief of today's events, day 29.
Large explosions and heavy smoke have been seen in what has been reported as the destruction of a large landing ship near the occupied port city of Berdyansk. Analysts believe that the Orsk, an Alligator-class landing ship, was hit by ballistic missiles. A confirmation made by the Ukrainian Navy on its Facebook page, where it claims to have destroyed the Russian Black Sea Fleet landing vessel Orsk in the Azov Sea port of Berdyansk.
Your mother?
The World Health Organization WHO branch in Ukraine says it is currently working amid extremely dangerous conditions as it strives to provide timely healthcare support in big cities. The head of the WHO country office in Ukraine adds that that's a sign of the challenging circumstances they're facing.
We need to be in the shelter when there is a bombing. And this is when you ask about what the healthcare workers are doing. Now we see the deliveries, which are in the basements of the hospitals. We see attacks on health. We know that it's not anymore always safe to be in the ambulance. And when we look to the doctors and nurses, they also are afraid about their life because so many healthcare facilities are under attack.
Anatoly Chubais, the architect of Russia's post-Soviet economic reform, has quit his post as a Kremlin special envoy and left the country due to the war in Ukraine. Chubais, who once served as former President Boris Yeltsin's chief of staff, left his post as Vladimir Putin's special representative for ties with international organizations.
In our country, there is a demand for anger. In our country, there is a demand for hatred. In our country, there is a demand for aggression. Just a few days ago in this city, people were marching with a poster, "Kill off the 5th column." And then today, Boris Nemtsov is killed. Let's just pause and think what will happen tomorrow. We all must stop.
Meanwhile, the 15-member UN Security Council on Wednesday failed to adopt a resolution on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. 2 members, Russia and China, voted in favor of the text, and 13 others abstained. The text submitted by Russia was rejected. Our Security Council resolution needs at least 9 votes in favor and no vetoes by either Russia, China, Great Britain, France, or the United States to be adopted.
The international community generally hopes to achieve a ceasefire as soon as possible, which is also China's strong expectation. We believe that while promoting a ceasefire, the Security Council should respond to the humanitarian crisis in a positive, pragmatic, and constructive manner.
And more refugees fleeing war in Ukraine continue to arrive in Romania, crossing the border at the northern town of Siret, the country's main refugee hub. Romania Emergency Services and volunteers provided refugees with supplies, food, and were offering counseling.
The VOA's Anna Chernikova is still in Western Ukraine. Anna, great to see you. We didn't mention this before, but let's begin with Berdyansk and the updates from there.
Hello. Yes, today Ukrainian forces managed to complete successfully a very, I guess, very difficult operation. But yeah, they destroyed a huge warship with a lot of military equipment and soldiers. As we know for now, the warship and also some other ships which were next to this warship with supplies, they've been destroyed, so damages are quite serious. No additional or more particular information yet, but this was a very successful and unexpected move by Ukrainian forces.
And Berdyansk is just west of Mariupol, and we've seen those satellite and drone images of the devastation in the city there. What is left of the once beautiful city of Mariupol, and what are you hearing concerning the Russian advance there?
Mariupol is still under Ukrainian control. Unfortunately, this is the city that suffered the most so far in this war. 90% of the city is destroyed, and according to the information, 30% of the city would never be able to actually restore again. So people are suffering. Humanitarian situation is catastrophic. There is no food, no water, no electricity, no medications. Russian forces do not allow humanitarian aid in. Some people managed to escape Mariupol with private cars, but still there are more than 100,000 people remain in Mariupol, and they are living in the basements for a couple of weeks now.
And this might also be frustrating times for aid agencies who are definitely trying to get to people who are trapped in Mariupol. But apparently, the Russian forces have not taken over any major city in Ukraine, would you say, Anna? Does that raise a lot of hope for Ukrainians?
Yeah, the only city that which is now under Russian control, big city, I mean, is Kherson. But the rest was not successful for Russian forces. Of course, this is a huge hope, and of course, this is a very, very important emotional cause for Ukrainians, because both army and civilians understand that they actually can act, and they actually can they can actually succeed in this extremely difficult circumstances with unexpected war that happened. So I would say that Ukrainians in this month, today is 1 month of war, Ukrainians' emotional and physical strength is as good as never.
And what have you been hearing? I know this is 1 month since the invasion began. What are you hearing from people on ground, especially where you are?
People mostly everywhere, I mean, I would say everywhere, are very positive. Even people who managed to escape Mariupol that I managed to talk to, I had a chance to talk to, they are very positive about the outcome, and they believe that Ukrainian army will win. Ukrainian civilian society, nation will win. So I should say that Ukrainians are very positive. Even those Ukrainians who lost their houses and lost their homes, I think that for Ukrainians now there is no way back. So the only way out of this is to succeed.
Indeed, I hear you, Anna, and I'm sure that other Ukrainians feel the same as well. But I know that you're also keeping tabs on that NATO meeting in Brussels, which has just ended. We'll hear about it in a minute. But NATO has announced it will be increasing eastern defenses. Is that comforting to Ukrainian military forces?
Well, it's very understandable, and I think that Ukrainian president addressed also this, thoughts to European partners that NATO countries which are bordering Ukraine should be ready and should be getting, their military forces in place. So, well, I mean, this is a very right and expected for you in Ukraine, expected step from NATO. So, yes, I think that this is kind of a logical step forward.
On the question of chemical weapons, do Ukrainians believe that chemical weapons are being used in the war?
Well, there are evidences of phosphorus bombs that have been used in Kyiv region and Kharkiv region. So there are footages with this, particular way that bomb is exploding. So yes, Ukrainians absolutely sure that this has been used, and but except of that, there is no information of other chemical weapons.
VOA's Anna Chernikova, always a pleasure. Thank you for talking to us, and continue to stay safe.
Thank you.
The second month since the beginning of the Russian invasion, many Ukrainian cities have been destroyed by rocket attacks, captured, or are still under siege.
The resistance of the Ukrainian army, coupled with international support, slowed down the advance of Russian troops.
But unprecedented severe sanctions have left Russia's economy. According to UN estimates, more than 5 million refugees have fled Ukraine. But here's a look at 1 month into the Russian invasion.
On February 24, Russian President Vladimir Putin launched what he called a special military operation against Ukraine, marking the start of the biggest military offensive in Europe since World War II. After Russian armed forces were unable to seize control of Ukraine with the lightning offensive in the first week of the war, they shifted strategy to the bombardment of cities with artillery, airstrikes and missiles. And on February 27th, with little progress made in Moscow's offensive, President Putin put Russia's nuclear forces on high alert, citing aggressive statements by NATO members and the financial sanctions. The dramatic move is seen as a warning to NATO not to intervene in Ukraine. Ukraine says civilian targets, including hospitals, churches and housing, have been hit, but Russia has denied targeting civilians. Russian forces have repeatedly struck the capital, Kyiv, but have failed to encircle the city. The besieged southern port city of Mariupol has been hardest hit, subject to weeks of bombardment that has killed at least 2,300 people and destroyed most of the city, according to Ukrainian officials. About 100,000 civilians remain trapped in the city without running water, electricity or heating, and with supplies of food dwindling. Only one major city, Kherson, has fallen to the Russians. People in the city have staged protests against the Russian occupation. They've been met with tear gas and gunfire. Russian forces have also seized 2 Ukrainian nuclear power plants in the country, including the largest in Europe. The United States has formally asserted that Russia's forces have committed war crimes in Ukraine, and President Joe Biden has accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of being a war criminal.
And in the Pacific.
The International Criminal Court has launched an investigation into possible war crimes. On the diplomatic front, Ukraine and Russia signaled they might be nearing an agreement on March 16th, but talks are dragging on, a reflection of the difficulty Ukraine faces in giving up aspects of its self-determination, such as joining the EU or NATO, and parts of its sovereign territory, including the Donbass region and Russia-annexed Crimea. Meanwhile, various countries around the world like Turkey, Israel, China and South Africa have stepped in to try and mediate in the situation. The United Nations says more than 3.6 million Ukrainians have now fled the country, and a further 6.5 million have been displaced within Ukraine. The war's death toll is unclear, but Ukrainian President Zelensky, who has become a symbol of national resistance, said on Wednesday that thousands of people have been killed, including at least 121 Ukrainian children. The war has also rattled the global economy and the geopolitical order. Economic sanctions on a scale never before placed on a $1.5 trillion economy are set to send Russia into deep recession this year. The World Bank warns the country is now in default territory.
Russia, go home! Russia, go home!
Solidarity for Ukraine has been immense, with thousands across the world, many visibly emotional, taking to the streets to denounce Russia's invasion of its neighbor, Ukraine.
World support Ukraine! World support Ukraine! World support Ukraine!
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky continued his address to European Parliament today. Speaking to Swedish lawmakers, he told them Ukraine is fighting for the security of the whole of Europe and deserves to be a full member of the European Union. He urged them to approve the decision at this time, and that he was sure that in this they would also support Ukraine. Swedish Parliament Speaker Andrea Norlin thanked President Zelensky for the important words and assured him of Sweden's support.
In particular, His Excellency. This has been a month now since the beginning of the biggest test, a full-fledged war that was started by Russia against our country. There has never been a black month of this magnitude since the Second World War. Such destructions and such war crimes would mean that all neighbors of Russia are in danger from now on. It would mean that you were in danger, because it's only the sea which divides you and this aggressive policy. And Russian propagandists already discuss on air of their TV broadcasters on how Russia will occupy your Gotland island and how they will control it for decades. They're showing this on TV to Russians on the map. We are fighting not only for Ukraine, we are fighting for the security of Europe, and we have proven that we deserve to be a full-fledged member of the European Union. The decision is already in the process. This is time to approve that decision, and I'm sure that in this you will also support us. Thank you, and thank you, Sweden. Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine.
Still to come on the program. NATO leaders meet in Brussels, approve major increases in the alliance's forces in Eastern Europe. Join us again. Welcome back. Flags are flying at half-masts on government buildings all across America today in honor of the country's first female Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who died of cancer on Wednesday at the age of 84. She had a remarkable career, serving first as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations from 1993 to 1997 in then U.S. President Bill Clinton's administration. He was the one who nominated her to become the first female Secretary of State, a role she took on from 1997 until 2001.
Madam Albright, America's 64th Secretary of State, was a tough-talking diplomat in an administration that involved itself in the two biggest foreign policy crises of the 1990s, the genocide in Rwanda and Bosnia-Herzegovina. The plain-spoken Albright took on a 1996 incident where Cuban jet fighters downed two unarmed U.S.-based planes.
In modern-day diplomacy, she recognized the threat of what Russia's invasion of Ukraine meant for the world. She had expressed her thoughts in a New York Times op-ed last month, saying, Mr. Putin's revisionist and absurd assertion that Ukraine was entirely created by Russia and effectively robbed from the Russian Empire is fully in keeping with his warped worldview. Most disturbing to me, it was his attempt to establish the pretext for a full-scale invasion. Should he invade, it would be a historic error.
Also saying about Putin, he was or has collected political and economic power for himself, co-opting or crushing potential competition while pushing to re-establish a sphere of Russian dominance through parts of the former Soviet Union. Like other authoritarians, he equates his own well-being with that of the nation and opposition with treason. He is sure that Americans mirror both his cynicism and his lust for power, and that in a world where everyone lies, he is under no obligation to tell the truth, because he believes that the United States dominates his own region by force. He thinks Russia has the same right.
At the UN Security Council, a moment of silence was observed for the woman who, as a child, fled the Nazis in her native Czechoslovakia during World War II, who then rose to become the first female US Secretary of State, and in her later years, a pop culture feminist icon.
In my national capacity as the first female ambassador of my country at the United Nations, I know that many women ambassadors since then owe Secretary Albright an enormous debt of gratitude. Her informal group of women ambassadors, which she dubbed the G7, was an important step for a more inclusive United Nations. Perhaps one day we will see here a G97 where half of the ambassadors are indeed women. And on behalf of the Council, I'd like us all present to stand and observe a minute of silence in memory of Madeleine K. Albright.
Joining us now is a woman who knew her well, former U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria, Robin Sanders. She joins us from Washington. Ambassador Sanders, great to see you, and thank you for joining us this evening. And we do want to convey our condolences on the death of Madam Albright.
Thank you so much for having me today. And yes, it is a very sad day for a lot of us who worked with her as either a young officer or certainly since she left office, doing a number of things on the democracy and leadership and women's rights issues.
How did her life and, her work impact on yours?
I think the most important thing that makes me think about her is when I was a very young officer, she became the United Nations, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And I think one thing I haven't heard thus far in the tribute to her is that not only did she have that post was elevated to a cabinet position when she had it. Prior to that, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, it was not a cabinet position. So when you think about the women that came after her that had that post, from Ambassador Rice to currently Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, those positions are now, that position now is a cabinet position, and Madeleine Albright, the late Madeleine Albright, was really key in making sure that that happened. So that legacy, I think, doesn't get as much attention, but for me as a young woman, it was extremely important. To your specific question about her time as Secretary of State, she certainly paved the way for it not to be uncommon to have a female Secretary of State for the United States of America. And prior to her doing that, it was considered uncommon. And now no one ever thinks about that. It's something that is almost the norm. We've had several female Secretaries of State since the late Madeleine Albright has been there. So you've had, of course, a Secretary Clinton, and you've had Secretary Condi Rice. And so she was a trailblazer, not just in sort of raising the profile of what women can do and where women can do it, but certainly on the policy front. I mean, she was a NATO specialist for a long time. She focused on NATO quite heavily during her tenure there. I know that I'm known for my expertise on Africa, but I did have a position where I was the backup on Bosnia and Kosovo. And so in that position, I got to participate in a lot of meetings and activities, and I could see where her leadership was so key, particularly on NATO expansion. starting the programs that expanded NATO, because she was a visionary as well, and she saw the importance of what NATO could do, not just as an alliance, but as a way to bring countries together to talk about a range of global policy issues and challenges. And we see the benefit of that today with the cooperation that's happening in Ukraine. I also got a chance to go to Bosnia and really see the work that she led and that she did on the ground there. And so I spent 2 years working on Bosnia and Kosovo, and I got a really close-up and personal perspective of all of her efforts and all of her leadership on NATO and the NATO alliance that we are benefiting from today.
Madam Ambassador, she's said to have paved the way for women in America's State Department, talking on leadership positions, some of which you've mentioned yourself as well. Looking at perhaps what she also said, she foresaw Putin, his intentions towards Ukraine. And, you know, she said this just before her death. Did she perhaps have any solution to what we're witnessing with the invasion now?
I think that there are two things. I want to just take one step back a little bit. Yes, she wrote this wonderful and very prescient article recently, but all along she knew Putin well. She met him many times. She had interactions with him, so she had a sense of what his vision of the world, what he wanted his vision of the world to be. And I think that her solution to that very early on was to ensure that you had a strong NATO, that you had a strong NATO alliance that looked at the world, not just from a security lens, but from a cooperation lens as partners. And I think that because of that, the cooperation that we are seeing today on Ukraine by the 30 members of the alliance, even by the G7, as well as the European Council, when you think about the fact in the next few days, you would have had all of these groups come together, the G7, NATO alliance, at 30 countries there, and they would have had the European Council meeting. One other thing that she did, which I also haven't heard as much on, but extremely important, and you know, NATO does a concept paper of what the strategy is going to be for the next several years. And the last one, Secretary Albright was very much involved with the last one was 2010. The upcoming one actually is coming up in May 2022. So she also set the stage for the future of what NATO was going to look like, and was always looked at as a sounding board and an expert on not only Russia and Putin, but certainly for sure on NATO and what the vision for NATO should be for the future. So she never left that role, and I think that her sense today, not only reflected in that article, but really for the message is for the NATO alliance to stay strong, stay together, be coordinated, listen to the challenges.
And it does seem like, you know, some may think that that was a disadvantage because, you know, one of the consequences of, one of her most consequential actions, both as ambassador and Secretary of State, was to support NATO expansion, which you alluded to. She cast NATO not just as a military alliance, but a pillar of international stability and an engine of democratic progress. Some say she even saw the alliance as a conduit through which the US could impart peace, order and good governance upon a fragile European continent. What do you think?
No, I don't buy that, actually, and I think that what we're seeing today shows that that's probably not a correct analysis at all. I think that if you knew her and you knew her vision, it was really about working together in cooperation. It wasn't sort of a hegemony kind of position at all. And part of that was to make sure that, you know, we work with our partners. I think you see that with the current administration, even prior to conflict that we're facing now with Ukraine. And it was always her vision to see that we were partners, and it was a global dialogue, and that we were partners on this vision of what democracies can do, should do, and how they should help their people. So no, I don't buy that as a downside in any way.
She even said to US senators back in 1997 that we do not need Russia to agree to the enlargement. Could that perhaps be what the Kremlin is referring to when it says for a long time that Russia's concerns have been ignored?
I think that's also a cop-out as well. I sat in a lot of those meetings that, kind of looked at where NATO was going to go, what NATO should be. There wasn't a challenge to Russia per se, but when you're talking to someone who has a different vision of the world that, in my view, is certainly non-democratic, certainly an autocratic vision of the world, they're going to be able to justify anything they do. So that's what they want to do, regardless of the consequences, regardless of the human life that is being taken, and without respect for human life. So I don't buy that either. Particularly, you can see that being played out today. There's no value in either the lives of his soldiers or the lives of innocent women and children and civilians. You have 10 million people that have been displaced. You have crushing hospitals and places where women and children live and killing innocent civilians. So you can't justify that. No matter what you do, it's not justifiable.
Ambassador Robin Sanders, a real pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for joining us today to remember the woman, Madeleine Albright, and once again, our condolences to you and the rest of America.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm says the U.S. and its allies are discussing a possible further coordinated release of oil from storage to help calm oil markets in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. IEA member states agreed to release over 60 million barrels of oil reserves earlier this month in a bid to cool rising prices, which have hit the cost of living and spurred inflation.
Brent crude oil prices traded around $120 a barrel today, well above the $105 price on the day of the last release. Speaking alongside Granholm, IEA Executive Director Fatih Birol said the earlier release constituted just 4% of the total storage of its member countries, which includes 31 mostly industrialized countries, but not Russia.
That it looks like the supplies will be, there's a response by the oil and gas market. It looks like oil supplies will increase by about 1 million barrels per year. At least our Energy Information Agency has a short-term energy outlook that has been updated to include those increases. That is not all that will be required, clearly. There's more to be able to do. And then just with respect to the emergency stockpiles, I think that was actually probably to you, but I'll just say that I think these are ongoing discussions and all those tools are certainly on the table.
Joining us now, Mr. Kola Karim, Chairman, Shoreline Natural Resources Limited. He joins us from London. Thank you for joining us on the programme.
Thank you for having me.
First, what have you noticed as to how the conflict in Russia's invasion of Ukraine is impacting the global community?
The uncertainty of global production is creating a mega problem across board. With 100 million barrels of oil consumption per day globally, Russia is producing about 9% of that. So you can imagine this problem is really shaking supply side of the market. And that's where we're seeing all this zigzagging in prices, but we'll continue seeing it for a while.
In terms of perhaps the impact, what would you say has been the biggest sector affected? And that is also, ripple effects across the world as a result of this invasion. And which countries are biggest hit to suffer from it?
Look, the real thing is this problem is reverberating all over the world. But the biggest countries to suffer would be the African, the third world countries who do not have refining capacity at all. So they're dependent on buying from refiners and buying from the global market. And when there's a supply side problem, the demand side feels the cold, and that's what we're seeing. So that's why you're seeing prices in countries like Nigeria, where Russia and the Ukraine, in that area of the world, the refineries are the major producers of diesel, and we're going to see real shorts in the diesel market, and that's what's affecting local prices right across Africa where diesel is being consumed. So this problem is going to be continuous till the market gets into a better perspective position, and we can ease up on the supply side.
At this meeting with EU leaders and the US president, do you see this as solidarity or unity in the face of the invasion? For how long, considering the countries who are hesitant on energy sanctions on Russia?
Look, there's a bigger problem, and the elephant in the room is looking at Germany. Germany, 55% of Germany, which is the largest European economy, 55% of its gas consumption comes from Russia. 30% of its crude consumption comes from Russia. 50% of its coal for its energy comes from Russia. So you can imagine they are in a very jittery position because they cannot come out wholeheartedly to support whatever sanctions being proposed, because that is going to really freeze the economy. Already remember, the world has just come to a pandemic, and that has created a big problem in supply. Now, global economy is waking up again. Manufacturing capacity is coming back up again. Transportation and people are flying left, right, and center again. So consumption and demand for oil is now going up. Then you have the supply problem with the situation with Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, which is creating a big pressure point on supply, and that is really a big situation for lots of economies, especially the developing world economies, because of the inflationary measures tied to this.
So these countries, I mean, the US, the EU, and allies, even in NATO, are just short of announcing sanctions on Russian oil. But what are the alternatives for them?
I don't see an alternative. You know, I don't see one, and this is why this is a very dangerous game. The world is going to go into a global recession if this continues this way. Why? It is very difficult to replace 10 to 11 million barrels of oil in a market if the whole out sanction comes on Russia. That's only on oil. Then talk about gas. A lot of the European countries on the eastern side up to Germany are depending on Russian gas. So if that's all shut down, you can imagine without immediate alternatives is a problem. I just saw the announcement recently that the US is looking at doubling up on its LNG supplies into Europe, but that is still going to take time. It's not something that's immediate. They have to ship it. There's shipping involved. So there is a lot, it's a moving process, and this is not going to be an easy fix. Everyone's going to be affected. We're all going to suffer. We already have seen the problems around commodities prices. Look, Africa today imports majority of its wheat and the majority of sunflower oil from Russia and Ukraine. This war has created a big problem. Look at Egypt already talking to the IMF in tapping IMF money in supporting them. This is a big problem in a country like Egypt where bread is subsidized. In countries in Africa where bread is a staple food, we're going to see problems because the price of wheat and other commodities is increasing.
Russia says it will turn to unfriendly countries to pay for its oil, and there's also talks about having India pay for oil at lower prices in Russia's ruble. What do you expect? How do you expect this will turn out? And this is really for Russia, who has been sanctioned, over 5,000 sanctions coming from the West.
Remember, the Russian oil companies have had large investments over the last couple of years in countries like India, where they bought the Valdemar refinery, and this is a 500,000 barrel a day refinery. So the capacity is there. So they will turn to countries like India. They are turning to countries like Russia, where refineries are already built to produce and process Russian crude. So it is going to be a difficult one, this cat and mouse game. I think reality is everyone, look, two elephants fight, the ground is going to suffer. Everyone's feeling the pain, including African countries and developing countries. It's not going to be an easy fix, but reality, true to point, is everyone needs to see reason, sit around the table and have a common position in sorting this issue, because it's going to affect everyone.
If you were to advise the Nigerian government now as to how to prepare, because no one knows which side, what's going to happen in the next couple of days in this war, what advice would you be giving?
Look, it's an opportunity and also a pain for Nigeria. One, the high oil prices is something that's good news to the Nigerian central bank, because oil is 85% of our foreign exchange earning capacity. But the situation also is our production target that was given to us by OPEC, we're not meeting that. So we're having a lot of supply problems internally, i.e. the pipelines and incursion on pipelines in Nigeria. And also that is a better problem because we also, the big problem also is on the aging infrastructure on the supply, well, export side as well. So the Nigerian government's focus today should be, one, try to stem the thefts that's going on in the oil and gas industry to help ease the position so the Federation coffers could get the dollars in from high oil production.
We appreciate your time. Thank you so much, Mr. Kola Karim, Chairman, Shoreline Natural Resources Limited, for joining us on the program.
Welcome back. NATO leaders have agreed, as we said earlier, to strengthen their defenses in the east in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That announcement was made by Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. His role as NATO chief has been extended for another year. During a news conference after today's meeting, he expressed concerns about Russia's accusation on Ukraine and allies as excuse to use chemical weapons. Let's take a listen to excerpts of that press conference.
So we are concerned, partly because we see the rhetoric and we see that Russia is trying to create some kind of pretext accusing Ukraine, United States, NATO allies for preparing to use chemical and biological weapons. And we have seen before that this way of accusing others is actually a way to create a pretext for do the same themselves. And of course, the accusations against Ukraine and NATO allies are absolutely false. Allies agreed to supply equipment to help Ukraine protect against chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear threats. This could include detection equipment, protection and medical support, as well as training for decontamination and crisis management. We are also enhancing allies' preparedness and readiness for chemical and biological and nuclear threats. Allies agreed that we must also increase our support for other partners at risk. So we are resetting NATO's deterrence and defense for the long term, with more troops, with more air assets and more maritime capabilities. We have already increased our presence in the East, and today we decided on 4 new battle groups, and the leaders agreed to task our military commanders to provide options for a long-term reset of our presence, our military posture in the eastern part of the alliance and across the whole alliance.
Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has accused Russia of crossing a red line into barbarism in its war with Ukraine, saying the West needs to tighten the vice and sanctions to bring the conflict to an end.
Look, I think everybody wants to see a peaceful, negotiated outcome if that were possible, but Vladimir Putin is plainly determined to double down on his path of violence and aggression. Absolutely brutal way he's treating the Ukrainian people. We've got to step up. We've got to increase our support, and we've got to tighten the economic vice around Putin, sanctioning more people today as we are, sanctioning the Wagner Group, looking at what we can do to stop Putin using his gold reserves, but also doing more to help the Ukrainians defend themselves. The UK, having been in the lead in giving anti-tank weaponry, is now giving 6,000 more missiles in addition to a lot of other support. But there are now dozens of nations that are supporting the Ukrainians, and we're moving really from a program of supporting resistance to supporting Ukrainian defense of their own country. Already Putin is seeing that his ambition, which was to try to intimidate NATO, is producing the opposite effect, and he's getting more NATO on his eastern frontiers rather than on his western frontiers, more NATO on our eastern frontiers, as it were, rather than less. And the UK is doubling down in Estonia. We're putting a detachment of planes in the sky above Romania. We're increasing our support for Poland, for all the Baltic states, and we will continue to do that.
Another meeting also held in Brussels today, and that was the G7 summit convened for an emergency meeting on Ukraine. The group of nations and the European Union are set to announce a new initiative aimed at stopping Russia from evading Western sanctions. The United States and G7 will make clear that any transaction involving gold related to Russia's central bank is covered by existing sanctions. The meeting of G7 advanced economies will bring Japan into the room with 6 NATO members. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called on G7, NATO and EU countries in meetings in Brussels earlier today to help Kyiv fight the invasion.
And the Kremlin has reacted to Moscow's latest expulsion of U.S. diplomats, saying that it was a forced measure after Washington last month said it was expelling 12 Russian diplomats at the country's UN mission in New York over national security concerns. The United States Embassy in Moscow received a list of its diplomats that were declared persona non grata in what Russian media said was a response to the U.S. move at the United Nations. Washington last month said it was expelling the Russian diplomats over national security concerns and later announced it would oust an additional Russian at the UN who it said was a spy. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov also said that Russia would address worries of Serbia, whose president complained that payments in rubles would create problems. The gas is delivered to Serbia via Bulgaria. Peskov also said that sanctioned Russian billionaire Roman Abramovich played an early role in peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, but the process was now in the hands of the two sides' negotiating team.
Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison today says he's been raising concern about Russian President Vladimir Putin's plans to attend the next G20 summit in Indonesia this year. Russia's ambassador to Indonesia on Wednesday said Putin intends to attend the G20 summit, dismissing suggestions by some G20 members that Russia could be barred from the group. The G20, along with the smaller group of 7 comprising just the US, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, Japan and Britain, is a key international platform for coordinating action on issues such as climate change and cross-border debt. Russia sent tens of thousands of troops into Ukraine February 24 in what it called a special operation to degrade its southern neighbors' military capabilities and root out people it called dangerous nationalists.
Russia has invaded Ukraine. I mean, this is a violent and aggressive act that shatters the international rule of law. And the idea of sitting around a table with Vladimir Putin, who the United States are already in the position of calling out war crimes in Ukraine, for me, is a step too far. We've been making very clear statements and representations about our very strong concerns about the involvement of Russia in the G20 this year. We want the Indonesian G20 to be a great success. We want it to focus particularly on the challenges of our region. So I think we need to have people in the room that aren't invading other countries.
And finally on the programme, mothers from Chevron Orad in western Ukraine found refuge and a kindergarten for their children at the Benedictine Sisters Monastery in Jaroslaw, Poland.
A 28-year-old mother, Natalia Kalber, told reporters she and her 3-year-old daughter Zlata were introduced to the church by her landlady. The Ukrainian mothers expressed gratitude for the help that they have received in Poland so far. While there's no active fighting happening in western Ukraine, uncertainty of the future and constant air raid alarms prompted the mothers to flee.
The children have been adapting well to their new environment, the mothers explained, some even picking up Polish already. Poland, home to the biggest Ukrainian diaspora in the region, even before the war, has taken in more than 2.1 million people. And while some plan to head elsewhere, the influx has left public services struggling to cope.
Just wait for those kids can be normal again. And that's the show today. Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.
I'm Melissa Ntwaka. Good evening.